The story you're about to hear is a compilation of documented true facts about historical characters, events, or locations. Please sit back and listen as I narrate this story to you. Pauline Picard, a 2-year-old girl from Gouas-a-Ludo, Brittany, France, went missing in April 1922 while playing on the family farm. It was a peaceful and secure neighborhood, and Pauline Picard's mother never hesitated to let her children play in the picturesque farmland. But when she called her daughter to dinner that night, she was astounded by the silence. Pauline's distraught parents enlisted the assistance of the local police and many volunteers in their search for her. This extensive search yielded no results and hopes began to dwindle. Many believed she had been kidnapped and ferried away by a local caravan of gypsies. A month later, police arrived at the Picard family farm with a photograph of a young girl found wandering alone in Cherbourg, a town about 200 miles away. Before the little girl was taken by Cherbourg police, a mysterious woman dressed in rags was seen with her, and the media claimed that this woman was the key to solving the mystery of Pauline's disappearance. Her mother recognized her from a photograph, and the police officer who discovered her was convinced it was the same girl. The mystery of how a toddler ended up hundreds of miles away from home was quickly forgotten in the aftermath of her safe return. The parents immediately boarded a train to Cherbourg to find their missing daughter, but the joyous reunion was not without its oddities. When the Picards met the girl, they weren't so sure. She resembled an underfed Pauline, but she didn't appear to speak Breton, the Picards' native language. While the Picards showered her with affection, she didn't seem to recognize them, instead treating them with the same babyish kindness she showed strangers. The Picards decided to take her home, hoping that their little Pauline was just traumatized and malnourished and would quickly recover. The other Picard children recognized Pauline right away. The neighbors too thought she was Pauline, and local police thought they had reunited the family. Pauline appeared to be fearful and shy from the start, and she never spoke in her native language. Her parents chalked up the discrepancies to trauma and ignored them for several weeks. The Picards reported that Pauline was regaining her identity and seemed to remember the farm at one point. However, the more time the Picards spent together, the more they doubted it was their daughter. The next few weeks were fraught with uncertainty. Newspapers report that she spoke some Breton, only to later admit that they were mistaken and that the girl was babbling. According to one newspaper, the Picard parents were certain the child was Pauline, while another reports their reservation. The family couldn't figure out how Pauline ended up 200 miles away from home a month after going missing, but stranger things had happened. Only a few weeks after returning home, the Picards began to suspect that the girl was not their daughter. During this time, another local farmer, Yves Martin, directly asked the parents if they believed the girl was truly their daughter before exclaiming, "God help me, I am guilty," and fleeing. The man was committed to a mental institution and was never seen or heard from again. Then something happened that turned Picard's world upside down once more. A nearby farmer was walking across the Picard farm when he discovered something truly disturbing. The body of a very young girl, decapitated, brutally disfigured, and naked with a skull nearby. The man went to the cops who went to the site with the Picards to investigate. The body was discovered decomposing in an area that had been extensively searched. The missing parts were the head, hands, and feet. Pauline's clothes from the day she went missing were neatly folded next to the corpse. A man's severed head was also discovered nearby, partially eaten by foxes. Even stranger, the site where the remains were discovered had already been searched during the initial canvassing of the area, leading investigators to believe the body had only recently been moved there. This broadened the scope of the investigation, as there were now 2 victims and a kidnapper and potential murderers still on the loose somewhere in the area. Gouas-a-Ludo was thrown into disarray for the second time in a year. During the 3 days it took the prosecution department to arrive, villagers and police officers took turns standing guard over the corpse. Her parents were afraid that this dead child was the real Pauline. A seemingly closed case had now devolved into 3 separate investigations. Who was the deceased girl? Who was the owner of the head? Ultimately, and tragically, no conclusion could be reached in a case that seemed to have an infinite number of unanswered questions. Was the delirious man who questioned Pauline's parents her assassin? Did he murder the man whose skull he found? Or did the skull belong to Pauline's assassin? Who were the Cherbourg girl's parents, and how could the Picard have so completely misidentified her? Unfortunately, no solutions could be found. Even with the Picard's identification of her clothes, there was still no proof that the body discovered on their property belonged to Pauline. The young girl was given the name Marie-Louise Pauline and was returned to Cherbourg under the care of the Franciscan Sisters of Notre Dame de Vaux. During the 1924 measles epidemic, she died while in the care of the sisters. The Picards buried the remains of the deceased girl in the local cemetery under the name Pauline Picard. Her parents were later buried alongside her. Her death date is listed as April 6, 1922, the date she went missing. The village was abuzz with speculation about who might have murdered the child. Christophe Keramon, an umbrella salesman who worked for the family, was investigated by police. He ate breakfast with the Picards the morning Pauline vanished and was overly fond of her, frequently cuddling her and promising her he'd find her a good home in another town. On the day the girl vanished, Pauline's parents had left the two alone together. Someone even overheard Keramon telling Pauline she was going with him. The police arrested him but eventually released him because his alibi was confirmed. Yves Martin, on the other hand, was later reported to have suffered a traumatic brain injury prior to his dramatic announcement. It's equally possible that his rantings were not a confession of guilt. According to an Algerian newspaper, while Martin did not murder Pauline, he didn't know who did. Someone in her family who had abused her, a recluse named Ronche Remorpi. The French newspaper Le Journal also blamed Pauline's family, alleging that she had been abused by a family member. They implied that her father, Francois, who had frequent violent outbursts, murdered her. There is no mention of anyone named Ronche Remorpi in any other sources. Perhaps Yves Martin witnessed the murder but made up a suspect, or maybe he wasn't involved at all. A rich couple kidnapped Pauline to replace their own daughter, according to a rather romantic theory that gained popularity among the townspeople, but not the police. The ostensible reason? If word got out that their daughter had died, they would lose their inheritance. The little corpse belonged to their own daughter. This jibed with reports that two mysterious strangers had been watching Pauline on the day she vanished, but the theory lacked both leads and evidence. It's possible that the strange emotions of grief and mourning hold the answers. Mrs. Picard, after all, could have simply wished too hard that the Cherbourg girl was her daughter and found herself willing to overlook the obvious flaws in that theory. Many still consider Yves Martin to be the prime suspect, even though his fate after entering the asylum was never revealed. What is the most perplexing aspect of this? The skull was never identified, and no missing men's identities were proposed. This is not the first time that mistaken identity and apparent amnesia of native language has perplexed the public. Ironically, during the same year in 1922, Anna Anderson was identified as the missing Grand Duchess Anastasia despite apparent language barriers, leading to controversial opinions and an eventual public rejection of the woman's claims. While police and the Picards agreed that the body had to be Pauline's, they were no closer to figuring out what had happened to her. Medical examiners were unable to determine whether the girl died as a result of violence, animals, or the elements. They eventually concluded that Pauline had wandered away, possibly during a tantrum, and died from frostbite. It was impossible to explain how her body turned up in an area that had been searched so thoroughly that if someone had lost a wallet, it would have been found, in the words of a local priest. Locals, including some police officers, continued to suspect homicide, pointing out that animals would not eat the head and extremities before devouring the abdomen. Most people now believe the body found on the property belonged to Pauline, but the identity of the owner of the disembodied head remains unknown. Hey everyone! I just wanted to express how grateful I am that you took time out of your day to listen to my narration. This is Nikki of Twysted Mind, and I'd like to wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Salamat!